We had a huge response yesterday to one of our next speakers, so we've invited him to rejoin us. And the other speaker we haven't heard from yet is the Executive Director of the American Conservative Union, our partners here, and one of the most influential organisations in DC and America. Please welcome Dan Schneider of the American Conservative Union and Congressman Mark Meadows.
It's good to be back with you. Now, I can tell you, I was sitting in the back and they said, well, we want you to come up after Nigel. And I said, no, I am not going to do that. And, Nigel, it's interesting, Dan. He is such a reserved individual. A typical Brit, real reserved. I wish he would just speak his mind occasionally. And so I think we're going to talk about a little bit more in-depth stuff, a little foreign policy. Some of you have asked about that. I don't know that it'll be quite as many personal stories about the president. Maybe we'll have a chance in the hallway, or some of you have asked me about my personal relationship with the. Now this says that we're going to talk for an hour. There is no way I'm going to follow him for 25 minutes. Thank you. You see this. So can I tell a real quick story? Very quick story before. So I was given a speech. I was actually the warm-up for the President of the United States. And so it was really good, because whenever the President of the United States is going to speak, you get a huge crowd. It was an unbelievable crowd. The only problem was the whole crowd was looking at their watch when I was going to get finished, because they wanted to hear the president, And so I was there, and I actually got there. They had the little clock there, and they had it all working, and they said, here's what we want you to do, Congressman. We want you to give a 10-minute speech. I said, not a problem. I can give a 10-minute speech. That is easy. But if the president is running early, we want you to cut that 10-minute speech off and make it a little bit shorter. I said, well, yeah, I can do that. Then they said, but if he's running late, we want you to add some time to it. So they wanted me to have a 10-minute speech plus or minus 10 minutes. It just, and so I said, sure, I could do that. And so I get up there and I'm looking down. There's a little clock here that, actually flashes red when we go over. And so same kind of clock there. I was giving this speech, and I got down, I looked, and I had about 3 minutes left. And I said, okay, I'm going to tell this one story. And I figured by the time I told that one story, it would be down to about 30 seconds, and I'd be able to go off. So I tell this story, and I'm getting there. I get the punchline, and I get right down to it. I look down at the clock, expecting to see 30 seconds, and it said 8 minutes. So I wind her back up, And so I start telling this story, and I'm going there, and finally I get down, and I get to the zero, and I come off the stage, and I said, well, Mr. President, were you running late? And I was talking to his staff, and they, oh, no, he was on time. You know what happened? He was backstage talking to my wife the entire time. I was out there sweating to death, trying to. So hopefully in the time remaining, we can be able to talk a little bit about foreign policy and speak to some of those things and maybe give you a glimpse of this president's foreign policy initiatives. But there's no one better to do that than my good friend who, listen, all of this, the CPAC that you see, it is really his, there's always the puppeteer, that actually handles all this stuff. Well, he's the master puppeteer. That's not for this, because it's actually been Mr. Cooper and Dan working together. But CPAC, as Nigel would say in Maryland, I was when he says, yeah, I go to Maryland every year. I think of it as Washington, D.C. It's really right across the Potomac River, so it's technically Maryland, but you can see the capital from where they have CPAC. They go across the Potomac. Do you all know? Have you ever heard of Potomac fever? Well, the reason that they have it over there is because once you come across the Potomac River, the politicians, they lose their backbone. I mean, they have a backbone of a banana. You peel it back, it gets real squishy. I mean, do you have politicians that do that occasionally? Yeah, I figured. But we're going to talk a little bit about foreign policy, if that's okay, and maybe later tell a few little Trump stories.
Before we begin, I need a volunteer on the front row. As we start to wrap things up, I need to mention one thing, but I haven't slept for 4 or 5 days. And Andrew, so I need somebody on the front row as we're wrapping up to wave your hand to remind me to mention. Are you going to be the volunteer? Okay, make sure to flag me down. But foreign policy, we are going to talk about foreign policy because some people are a little mystified at what President Trump believes and what a Trump doctrine is. So we have Mark Meadows here, who is just an extraordinary member of Congress. The American Conservative Union has rated members of Congress for 50 years. I know things are done differently in Australia, where members of Congress really they're expected, or rather the Parliament, are expected to vote with their party. Well, it's not done that way so much in America. Mark Meadows has one of the highest ratings that we give. So we are very pleased he's here. He's also, served on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's the co-chair of the Transatlantic Committee. So he as well as understanding economic policy and social policy, he also really knows foreign policy. So I want to just ask a big, broad, bold question right up front. The Reagan doctrine, peace through strength, Americans have been reminded what it is, as it is different from the Bush doctrine. But how does the Reagan doctrine differ from the Trump doctrine?
Well, I think that, and when you think of that peace through strength, and it's having a strong military, it's being able to defend our values, and yet using that in a very restrained way. And I think that what the President Trump has done is rebuild our military. Now, and that concerns a lot of people, even a lot of people here in Australia. They say, well, is he out there to try to start a war? And I can tell you, having had conversations with the President really during some critical times, Dan, where, well, even recently, when our drone was shot down by the Iranians, everybody expected him to do a strike back immediately, and yet it was a very measured. In fact, if anything, it was really concerning, and it was touch and go there for a while. But his natural inclination is to actually not be someone that comes in and says, we're going to start a war here, here, and here. And yet, if you read the media, I mean, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, how many of you have heard that he wants to start a war on at least 10 fronts, Yeah, I mean, and that is so different than where this president really is. And so that's, in that way, they're alike. Here's the other way. He believes that having a strong military that is truly the best in the world becomes a major deterrent to those that seek to do us harm, and not just us harm, but our allies harm. And when you know that you have the capability literally to intervene in a very sophisticated way, strategically, and yet you don't do it, it provides a real deterrent. And what we saw with Reagan and what we are now seeing with this president, much to what the mainstream media wouldn't say, is that countries are respecting our power once again. And they need to respect that power, but more importantly, they also have to understand that this president, he doesn't bluff. I mean, would y'all agree with that? Yeah, and what I love about things is if he says, I am considering doing it, he really is considering doing it. I get used to politicians that say all the time, especially on foreign policy, this is the red line. You've heard that before, probably from across the pond, right? Okay, but this is the red line. They don't really mean it's a red line, they mean it's a yellow line that if you pass it, that they'll put another yellow line and then another yellow line. It's kind of like a parent. Have you ever counted down to where you're going to have some kind of consequence with your children? So you go, I'm going to count to 3. And so they go 1, 2, 2.5, 2 3/4, 2 5/8, 2 9/16. It gets to the point where you never get to 3, and yet this president is willing to do that, and yet let there be consequences. We've seen it in Syria. We've seen it literally with the way that he uses perhaps economic power and non-military power that can concern some traditional conservatives. I mean, I'll just be real blunt. Some of us, you get worried. Do we want economic back and forth? And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit of this foreign policy. But he really believes that a strong America first does not mean America alone. And here's the news: he wants America first, but he also believes that your prime minister should want Australia first. And that, I can tell you, we do not pull for Australia in the Olympics when you are going against the United States. I'm just telling you, I know that's a news flash out there, but if we're not in the Olympics and you don't have it, I pulled for Australian swimmers. I think I'm going every single stroke in those Summer Olympics, because what do? We have those shared values. And so when it's not us, we want you to win.
I do have to admit, I am a Costa Zoo fan.
Okay. All right. Well, what I want to do is, since we're talking just briefly about sports and not foreign policy, will somebody help me understand this great game of cricket? I don't understand it. I mean, you got crickets and wickets, and and you're looking up there, and I mean, there will be a cricket game going on, and you think you're watching reruns, and it's the same game going on. I mean, come on.
Well, Congressman, you mentioned Syria. Our good friend is K.T. McFarland, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor at the time. Are you all aware of the U.S. missile strike on a Syrian Air Force base? The Syrians had crossed that red line. Obama had laid several red, meaning yellow lines, and nothing ever happened. Trump said, if you do this, you will pay a price, and it'll be immediate. And Syria crossed that line. I knew, because the Trump doctrine is more similar to a Reagan doctrine than a Bush doctrine, I knew that did not mean that we were going to invade Syria. But I was really interested to see what is going to happen, and I thought that the U.S. missile strike was perfect. It hit 1 out of 9 Air Force bases. It had very limited loss of life, but it took out a real military threat. It was a one-time strike, and Syria got it. If they cross a red line, they're going to pay a price, but it was a measured price.
Well, it was a measured price, and I think here's the other thing is this president in particular believes that we have to have a strong military, a very clear foreign policy. And sometimes, we have a State Department that goes from administration to administration to administration, and a lot of times the policy is ambiguous. It's kind of like trying to figure out a cricket game. You can't figure out unless you know the rules exactly what's going to happen. And so this president came in and actually said what we're going to do is when we say there's a red line, we're going to do that. And yet, the biggest thing that I know that you have a concern with and that we have a concern with is when you send your sons and daughters to fight in a war. This president, and perhaps this will make headlines, there is nothing more critical that he takes personally is when he looks at deployment of sons and daughters to go into harm's way. And he does that as a father, but he also does that with a bit of compassion where he's looking at some of these endless wars that we've gotten involved with. And he says, why are we there? What's the strategic purpose for us to be there? And he's gone toe-to-toe with generals, Dan, and I think that's the big thing is you have generals that have one job, and you have a president in our country that has a different job, and you have diplomats that have a different job, and yet he brings all of those together to say what is the appropriate response in Syria. I'm a big fan of Katie McFarland. I think she is just a super individual. I wish she were, more intimately involved in this administration. And yet, when it was, we mean what we say, we'll give a proportionate response, and yet not a long, drug out, boots on the ground kind of thing that all of us are concerned about. And so I think some of his foreign policy, now people realize that he means what he says, but yet at the other side of that, I can tell you one of the things that bothered me the most from a foreign policy standpoint when this president came in, we were truly concerned about a nuclear strike from North Korea each and every day. It kept me up at night. I mean, and yet this unconventional foreign policy interaction with a North Korean leader that would have been applauded by the left if it were a different president, but it's condemned by the left because it's this president.
I want to ask a question of the audience here. You got two Americans. We're not here to preach at you about what Australian policy ought to be, but I'd like a show of hands, and really be honest. It's going to be valuable for us. President Trump will talk about, sometimes how he's good friends with the North Korean leader. How many of you like when he does that? Raise your hands. How many of you do not like it when he does that?
All right, that scientific poll we'll take back to Washington, D.C. But no, that's helpful because I think what happens is this president wants to have a relationship with foreign leaders, more so than I've ever seen, and not just the traditional foreign leaders. When you talk about Prime Minister Abe and the president, they actually have a personal relationship, beyond golf, and they have a personal, even President Xi, in the midst of a very difficult, what I would say, trade war that we have going on right now. There's a relationship there that this president wants to have, and he wants to establish those relationships so that when he comes into a room and there's hands that go up, that he doesn't get surprised by the feeling of our allies. And so I can tell you that with President Xi and with President Abe and now one of the other things, we have 5 minutes left. Is that what that's what you were told? Now, you were told to raise your hand for a totally different reason. No. Okay. And so
we're getting our money's worth.
Yeah, I tell you what. But one of the things is when you look at a state dinner, those are reserved just for really the friends that there's a priority. And to have the second state dinner be with your prime minister hopefully sends a clear message that not only do we want a relationship, but we want to build on that strong bond that we've had. And so we're looking forward to having your prime minister come in September. And we just really thank you for the relationship.
I want to raise one more issue before we begin to wrap up. The Reagan doctrine and the Trump doctrine share a lot in common, but there are probably different approaches to how trade is utilized as part of national security. How does President Trump use trade and trade policy for the national security of America and for the rest of the free world?
He does use it very differently, and some would be extremely critical. And I can tell you, they were extremely critical when we actually lowered taxes in the United States to actually have our economy grow. And you've heard about that already. We already did that, and we lowered taxes. Actually, we lowered tax rates. Let me give you a news flash. We lowered tax rates, but tax revenues went up. It's amazing when you lower something, you actually get more of it when you talk about taxes. So we actually had increase in tax revenue. We had an increase in economic growth. And what he wants to do is use that economic policy around the globe to make sure that we have a level playing field. You get to see it. Your trading partner, one of your biggest trading partners here is China. And so when you see that, you want to have a fair trading relationship with China, but not one where you're beholden to them, where you feel like you're in bondage to your trading partner. And we've done that, and we need to stop it. We need to stop it. Now, newsflash, they need you more than you need them. And you've got exports that are going there, and I say that, and there will be 3 economic professors at some university here in Australia that will disagree with me, and they will be wrong. But I'm here to tell you that what happens is this president is about resetting it for the globe, not just for America, that hopefully what you'll do is when you have a transaction with your trading partners, and he's focused on Australia, Japan, South Korea, China, Vietnam, all, this whole realm, but he believes that it needs to be fair. It can't be manipulated where you have a government subsidized program that disadvantages Australians. And so that's how he's using it. And he's getting pushback in America, from some of his own party. He probably gets beat up more from his own party on his economic policies, and yet they're all enjoying it. I can tell you, my constituents, their paychecks are bigger, they're happier, they're not concerned that they're going to get laid off tomorrow, and we need to make sure that everyone enjoys that.
I think now is the time for you to sort of wave at me.
Well coached. Yeah, I tell you.
I do want to, as we wrap up, I want to make a comment about why we're all here. We've been doing CPAC in America for 50 years. And the American Conservative Union is about educating everyday Americans. The barber in Topeka, Kansas, the Pizza Hut owner in Tuscaloosa, the plumber who lives in Charlotte. It's everyday Americans. That's who we're focused on, because that's what the American experiment is about. Can people govern themselves? The warm-up act right before the congressman and I came out here, he's been leading a sovereignty movement. Well, that's what classical liberalism is. That's what conservatives are conserving, classical liberalism. The idea that each person is unique, deserving of equal dignity and respect, that your rights are naturally yours. Government doesn't give you your rights. Government's to protect your rights. So Nigel Farage, and he was a wonderful warm-up act for us. Nigel Farage.
That'll go on my resume. Nigel warm-up for congressman, yeah.
This is what he is telling the people of the UK, that they need to be free and independent. This is the message that's going around the world. Now, you'll later hear from the chairman of the Japanese Conservative Union, and we've worked with him to launch CPAC in Japan. We're getting ready for our 3rd annual CPAC in Japan. 24 different countries have asked us, can you help us put CPAC on in our countries? Andrew approached us. We're here because this is his vision. He approached us and said, it's time for CPAC to hit Japan. So this is what I want to leave you with. We're talking about foreign policy. We're talking about freedom, because the fight in America, the fight here, the fight all over the world, ultimately is about your individual liberty versus authoritarian regimes. That's what this is about. You being here means that you are soldiers in this fight. Without you, the world is lost. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. If individuals don't stand up and fight for their individual rights and protect their national sovereignty, we lose. So we are here today to help you, because that is what is good for everybody in the world who yearns to be free.
Dan, well said, and I would say this. Listen, whenever you start something new, there's always a fear that you throw a party and nobody shows up. And yet all of you have come with your time, you've dedicated your time, and candidly, your ideas. And one of the things I kept reading about was why Dan and I were coming here to Australia was to bring our values to you. And nothing could be further from the truth. What we want is your sovereign values to be highlighted so that other people will see that freedom and limited government works in Australia and the United States and anywhere else it is deployed. So when you have all your neighbors saying, yes, you went to that thing and they were trying to get you to have American values, I want you to have Australian sovereign values. Let's celebrate our diversity in that way. But let's also understand that we have a common goal of allowing liberty and freedom to have a seed in everybody's life so that we can all prosper. So God bless you. Thank you so much for allowing us to be here. We love you. Love you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. You got a nice smile, by the way. Thank you.